professional Russian army is, it's apart from the staff officers, is pretty much dead, So they've got a command and control issue, They can't really, they've lost so many tanks and AIFBs, that they can't really combine arms. And when they did, I don't know, like 2 months ago, you saw like the footage of the shock, and they had a company attack. And I mean, it was wiped out in 2 minutes. It was just, you're like drones, artillery, ambush, and you're like, holy moly, So I don't know if that was due to incompetence or not. I don't have the big context of that, but it just showed you how lethal the defensive form of warfare is if you get in the lighthouse, as it were, of everything. You know what I mean?
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Patrick Bury, Senior Lecturer at the University of Bath and a former British military officer. Patrick, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thanks for having us again, James.
First of all, how would you describe the phase of the war that we're currently in?
That's a good question. I would say we are in a positional phase where the general dynamics have kind of bogged down on the ground. In the land phase, there's not much ground changing hands, despite Russian efforts to do so. I think the defensive form of warfare is in the ascendancy. That makes it particularly difficult because of the nature of ubiquitous intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems. And I think both sides are hoping, on the Russian side, hoping that by stretching and attriting the Ukrainians, that something will give in the land domain, complemented by other supporting factors that they're getting into a groove with, we can talk about. And I suppose on the Ukrainian side, what they're looking for is more weapons and potentially looking at the F-16s and of course, what's constantly asked for, these heavier ATACMS missiles, given the clearance to shoot at logistics and air bases inside Russia, to kind of take away some of the Russian support and get into a groove. You know what I mean? So what I'm saying, I suppose, is it's positional at the moment, and both sides are looking at the supporting enablers of land warfare to try to generate some momentum.
I want to come back to the F-16s and long-range missiles like the ATACMS in a moment, but there has been a lot of talk in recent weeks about Russia having supply issues. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and I've seen like recent guests on here talk about that, and with good reason. We saw yesterday footage of the T-62s being moved, and people talk about these were used for the crushing of the Czechoslovak, rebellion, as it were, uprising. Well, first of all, like, they're only useless in certain roles, depending on what they're used for. That's the important thing. Like, if it's positional artillery and they've got enough artillery for them and they're dug in, they might actually, and tanks are being used like that a lot, by the way. So, secondly, of course, it indicates that they're running out of good tanks. Of course, we saw the Defense Intelligence Agency talk yesterday about the casualties that Russia's facing in May and June of 30,000 a month. 1,000 a day, the highest since they've taken since February, and that's all well and good. But they're adding 30,000 a month. They have been for the last year. Recruiting. It's costing them. Yeah, it's costing them up now apparently $60,000 a year to pay a recruit to fight. But they're doing it still. Now, question about sustainability: can Russia actually sustain that? Are they going to run out of people that are motivated by that cash to keep joining up? Maybe. But then guess what? They can mobilize. We're talking about a population of 140 million, of which I'm sure there's probably about 35 million fighting age males. I just think we underestimate Russia's capacity to take casualties and stay in the fight at our peril. And the Western view of this is based on sometimes on our own concepts of how we fight and force organize. And we've seen that with the willingness to take casualties, which is just a part of Russian society. Let's be honest. So yeah, I'm not a macroeconomist. I can't even say the word. And the indicators, of course, people say, well, if you take that many, if you start to mobilize the population, you take people out of the Russian economy, it can't sustain this amount of paying people. Yeah, I agree with that. I think strategically, the window of opportunity that Russia had over the summer is starting to narrow as a result of all this. But I suppose I'd have a word of caution especially about the people running out of manpower. I'm not convinced.
One thing we have seen over recent weeks and months is Ukraine increasingly having success at targeting Russian military sites. And in fact, only yesterday there was a site as an attack on called Kavkaz, which is near Crimea but within Russian territory. I mean, presumably the significance of that is its location and the fact that it is pretty much as close as you can get to the Kerch Bridge.
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen over a number of months now is sustained development of Ukraine long-range strike through UAVs. And it's going at infrastructure, essentially military logistics, oil refining capability, transport hubs, etc. And it's having an effect. I think it's moving. I think it's moved from sort of initially a tactical effect to starting to have, because there's been enough of them, to start having an operational effect. And I think we'll see more of that. It's one of the things they can do. We've seen them do it again. Another success story for Ukraine is the Black Sea Fleet. Although, it's pushed it back. It's had to retreat from Sevastopol. A lot of actually the Navy ships, Russian Navy ships that have been hit aren't that capable. They're landing ships, etc. They're what we call a brown water fleet. I'm not a Navy person, but you know what I mean? They're not the big important vessels that go out and do the sort of strategic operational missions, etc. They're supporting vessels. So, but it's good news. It's good news. I mean, it's good news for the Ukrainians, what they've done with the air defense, especially around Crimea, and really driven them back. And it's similar, the introduction of the HIMARS further north outside Kharkiv, that pushed a lot of Russian air defense that was forward and shelling Kharkiv. The S-300s, the HIMARS just basically pushed them back out further behind Belgorod. So, this is how introduction of more systems, US systems, has an almost immediate impact on the front line and places. And we could say, you could deduce that if ATACMS were given the clearance with the heavier warheads to hit the air bases and the logistics hubs inside Russia, that would have a very fast impact. In the same way that HIMARS did when they were introduced in September 22, and still do to a degree.
Well, yeah, let's just pick up on that. I mean, because that has been something that President Zelensky's been calling for some time. And yes, the West has lifted some of the restrictions in terms of how Western-supplied weapons can be used inside Russia, but there are still quite significant restrictions. If they were lifted, how would that transform things?
Well, for example, so a lot of the air, it depends what depth they were allowed to strike inside Russia. But a lot of the air bases, so what's really been particularly effective for Russia, and they're getting into a groove, and we can talk about this a bit, one of the things you've probably heard about it is using their strategic bombers to launch the heavy glide bombs, which are cheap, outside Ukrainian air defense range, and let them glide in to hit infrastructure targets, which is going to have a major impact. I mean, they've been bombarded, the Ukrainians have, and come winter, it's going to be a very, very tough winter given the amount of pounding they've taken. And it's not cost effective to use expensive Patriot missiles or even the Astros, etc., against these glide bombs, which are fairly cheap. So what you want to do is hit the bases and force the bombers back, essentially. And so that would be one thing you could do. Obviously, these bombers have long ranges, but you make it more difficult. You hit the bases, you hit the logistics supply in the bases. The other one, it can drop. The heavier munitions in the Kerch Bridge, etc., has been one that's been consistently asked for and not given. As an example of an attack on multiple of them being able to, with the heavier warheads, to be able to drop the Kerch Bridge. I don't know how significant the Kerch Bridge really is now, under damage, etc., with other routes. So it's essentially that pushing. A lot of it is about pushing systems and air cover and ranges, artillery ranges, further back, because you've got the precision fires to hit them and then not be able to negate them. So yeah, I think it would be important, especially combined with the introduction potentially of F-16s, depending on what scale, etc. F-16s would be useful because, see, one of the things the Russians are getting into the groove of is this persistent ISR. So they now have the drones, the dynamic targeting cycle backed up by the drones. Enough, again, something, one of the things they're not producing, tanks are struggling with, other parts, fighting vehicles, etc., clearly. But, they've massively increased their production of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. We'll even see about like hypersonics. And depending on the value of that persistent ISR, and it's, up to like 50K behind the Ukrainian front line. Depending on the value of the target they can identify, they can fire within 3 minutes, like a hypersonic. They have them, depending on what it is, if it's a Patriot system. So I think, the F-16s actually could be quite useful against taking down drones, depending on the capabilities of the actual ones that go in. It's cheaper, yeah, than firing air defense. But of course, there's a big problem about short-range air defense. It's not only the strategic systems we've seen about the Patriots needing to, again, help push back those bombers out of potentially glide range. It's also about the short-range air defense and these drones, which have got a system going now, so that if you show yourself in Ukraine on a front line, before where they were targeting, infrastructure and defensive positions. Now there's a fight going on, a tactical battle going on, and they can drop a glide bomb onto a tree line, which is sort of getting into the stage. It reminds me kind of the way that the US could fight in Afghanistan, persistent ISR clued in. Now, there's a lot of EW going on there too, and trying to jam it. The Ukrainians are clued in with their apps and working out where things are, but it does have a suppressive effect on the battlefield. You're not going to move a tank to support an infantry fight if it's going to get spotted by an FPV and attacked straight away, or a Lancet or whatever. So yeah, that's the kind of
And on the F-16s, I mean, it feels like we've been talking about them for getting on for a year now in terms of their arrival and how significant they will be. I mean, it feels like they are about to be deployed soonish. Yeah. How much of a difference do you think they will actually make in reality?
It depends. I've also read that they're going to be allowed to attack Russian jets inside Russian airspace. So that would be pretty significant. I think what they'll probably do is ease them in. But it's interesting. What the Ukrainians like to do, basically, when they get a new weapon system, is do something which catches the Russians off guard. So they've got that. Oh no, so you don't announce it until something's happened. You saw that with Storm Shadow, saw it with the HIMARS, saw it with the ATACMS. They'll use them on an airfield or whatever. So potentially, if that clearance is there, it depends, I suppose. I think they might do an air ambush or something like that, on something in maybe Ukrainian airspace, try to catch them off guard. But really, the strength of the F-16 is the squadron level. Groups of aircraft being able to take on and clear the skies a bit more. But they're going to lose them too. The West would lose if NATO went to a war now with Russia. They've got a very complex and generally functioning air defense in most of the front line. We'd lose aircraft even if we were trying to suppress their air defense. We just would, and that's what you're taking into the account. So you're going to see some aircraft be shot down, of course. But I think really what the capability of the F-16s becomes significant once they can deploy multiple squadrons and they get a bit of mass behind it, and then they can patrol, they can rotate, etc. I think we're a bit off that, by the way.
What is your take, Patrick, on when Ukraine might be able to launch a new counteroffensive? I mean, are we looking at 2025 at the very earliest?
Oh, yeah. That was out the window. I mean, that was out the window when they delayed the aid. The three things happened at the end of 2023. The first one was the delay of the US aid, which needed to go in October. The second one was the mobilization order, for political reasons, didn't happen quickly enough. And the third one was building of fortifications and defenses to stabilize the front. None of those happened. Handed until April. They started building defenses in January, December, in fairness. But the effect of those is nothing was really started to be felt or made a decision until April, and then Russia had this window of strategic opportunity, which I would have definitely thought they would have done better than they have. Taken significant casualties, making tactical gains. Yes, it's stretching the Ukrainians. Yes, the Kharkiv offensive stretched the Ukrainians too. Made them redeploy brigades, some of them really good brigades from the front line. But I would have expected them to do better somewhere, at least. And that doesn't mean we're out of the woods. There's a lot of serious fighting going on in Toretsk and Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, which is probably the areas to watch at the moment. But so far, the Ukrainians are holding the line. And actually, some of the biggest successes the Russians have had is because of the shortage of Ukrainian manpower. So they're trying to swap units from heavy areas of fighting because they can't take them off the line. So they're trying to swap units in, and of course, in that kind of chaos that happens, the Russians realize now would be a good time to attack, and they've made quite good gains in place, especially around Toretsk.
It's a really good point you raise about Russia not pressing home its advantage and having this window of opportunity this spring and summer, and maybe not taking as much advantage as it should have done. What do you put that down to?
Multiple factors. Like we know they've gone into the groove with the ISR and the dynamic targeting, so that's a positive for them. Ballistic missile, new missile attacks, etc. But I think really, and I said this before to you, like the professional Russian army is apart from the staff officers, is pretty much dead. You know, so they've got a command and control issue. You know, they can't really. They've lost so many tanks and AIFVs. You know that they can't really combine arms. And when they do, I don't know, like 2 months ago, you saw like the footage, it was shocking. They had a company attack. And I mean, it was wiped out in 2 minutes. It was just, you're like drones, artillery, ambush. You're like, holy moly, you know? So I don't know if that was due to incompetence or not. I don't have the big context of that, but it just showed you how lethal the defensive form of warfare is if you get in the lighthouse, as it were, of everything. You know what I mean? In the lighthouse. So I think they struggle with combined arms. I think where they've had successes, they've fought, let's say in Kharkiv, they've fought in small groups, and increasingly small groups. You know, sometimes these battles are now down to the squad level, because of this, you know, obviously the difficulty in coordinating, there's a lack of officers in training. These are pretty much, you know, you're lucky now if you've got like 3 or 4 weeks training, even on Ukraine and Russian side, you know, maybe 6 weeks if you're one of the more elite units, but so it's very difficult to do stuff, and it's down to the squad level. That's what they're doing. You're trying to find gaps, and they did that kind of successfully actually in Kharkiv. You know, not really with much artillery support or any tank support, but they're also taking advantage of this swap around of lines up there too, of forces in the line. So I think it's really that it's a degradation of professional capability. And of course, quality, quantity, etc. And as I said, the defensive form of warfare, the Ukrainians found this, is in the ascendant. It's easier to defend than attack now.
I wanted to ask you, Patrick, about a report in the Times yesterday that a record number of Ukrainians are in favour of surrendering territory to Russia to end the war and preserve their country as an independent state. This is a poll that's been conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. 1 in 3 people, or 32% now, say they would agree to cede territory to Moscow to bring about peace. The figure this time last year was 10%. Now, they weren't asked specifically which areas would be ceded, but what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it's the reality of the situation, and you'd expect that to go up. I mean, they got over the euphoria of the resistance and the successful resistance of destroying the Russian army, you know. And then the even greater one of the Kharkiv counter-offensive in 2022, you know, September 22. And then the build up to the summer offensive last year, which flopped for multiple reasons. And look, I think that mirrors what will happen, the ultimate outcome. I think, and not to be defeatist, I totally want Ukraine to win this, but I just think the reality of the situation is likely more. I mean, a lot depends on US politics. You know, obviously that situation becomes very likely if Vance and Trump are in, as they've made clear. If it's Harris and another, the US may start to help. But it's like you said, 2025, like they're not going to really be able to attack until then at all, and they'd have to start hitting mass training now, which they're getting, you know, people through the pipeline. There's plans ahead, but you need to give people more than 4 or 6 weeks training, especially the infantry who are bearing the brunt of this. You know, like I used to be in the army over in the UK, and I was infantry. I did like a year and a half training plus 2 years on the job before I went to Afghanistan. You know, and we still made mistakes. So yeah, and this is another level of threat. This is a conventional threat. So they need to sort out the training. They need to sustain their manpower to the manpower pipeline that they have. They've got going, but they need to continue it. The people are still motivated. But really, like, what are they going to do? Say they get, okay, so you could end up with a situation in 2025 where the Russian economy starts to really tank. No one wants to join. He mobilizes. It's unpopular. There's uprisings going on again, and the army on the front line, the morale starts to collapse. I mean, like, it's plausible, but it's not that's a lot of variables, and it's not in the sort of like more likely thing yet, I don't think. And given that, so this, if you take and the defensive form of warfare is in the ascendancy, and I think, like, even if Ukraine can do something, they generate the force, they get the F-16s, they get into more of a groove in the training. It's still going to be fairly limited, barring a political or morale collapse. They might, and again, the place that makes sense, although they've tried it, once it'd still be Zaporizhia to shorten the line and take back that part of their country and put Crimea under coverage. So, and they've tried that once. So do you know what I mean? It's very difficult to see where and how exactly from where we are now. And I think both sides are probably going to start to tire of this. That's what I think. I think Russia will too. And if the risks to Putin's regime rise from, say, February next year, as the economists are telling us they will, and that's probably the area where people start to maybe look at what an outline of an agreement could be.
Yeah, I mean, the politics of this are crucial, because particularly what happens in November, because were the Democrats to win and they remain committed to funding support for Ukraine, potentially that completely alters Putin's mindset and his approach. If Trump gets back in, I mean, given opinion polls such as this one we've just been talking about, that would be music to Trump's ears, because he's still saying he could bring the war to an end and have a peace negotiation within days of even being elected.
Well, I think what will happen, despite the security pacts that Biden has signed and the pledge of $40 billion by NATO members, the executive powers of a president are pretty high, and they can just slow walk stuff and start to turn it off on the way in. And they'll probably say that to Ukraine. Look, we don't see this as our strategic interest. You're in a borderland area. Borderland is where values meet reality, real politics. We've funded you for such and such amount, and we're not doing that. We've got bigger fish to fry. I mean, Vance has said we want to pivot to Saudi Arabia and Israel and China, and leave this to Europe. I can understand a bit of that, but I mean, it's about values then, and what does that show? The US says it wants to pivot to China. Well, what does that show Taiwan, who's a big, per capita donator of military aid to Ukraine? So, basically, it's about credibility then, isn't it, too? So, yeah, look, the rest is politics. I mean, I do think it's very important. I think if Kamala Harris gets in, I think the calculus of Putin, the strategic calculus, that might be affected by that. About again, do I have the long-term economic base to continue this at sufficient risk, or do I just claim Donetsk? Make some deal around Donetsk and Luhansk. I don't know about Zaporizhia. It sticks so far out as an isthmus. I don't see how the Ukrainians could accept that. But
and if it does go long, this war, which seems to be one of
it's already gone long, James.
I mean, it already has, but if it goes, I mean, you have Jens Stoltenberg, obviously outgoing Secretary General of NATO, saying the other day that this could be a decade-long war. If it is a decade-long war, and I mean, we should say, of course, that the invasion started really back in 2014, so you could argue it's been 10 years already.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Since the full-scale invasion, let's say it's still going in 2030. What is Russia's approach to it then? I mean, is that bad news for Russia if it is a long war?
That's a good question. If it can sustain it, again, you're talking about really getting into the macroeconomics here, and this is not my expertise. If it can sustain it, as I said, it's sufficient risk to Putin's regime or the next replacement, then it's okay, I think. It becomes very interesting in terms of who wins in that situation. Very clearly China, right? That's what they want. They say, oh yeah, we want to cut a deal and all this. And it's nonsense. They just want us to roll and roll and roll, because it's buying up US resources and bandwidth and military aid, and keeping them tied down to their focus. That's my reading strategically, and I think most people agree with that. So that's where it gets interesting. A long war like that, especially when we're talking, the head of the army, the new head of the army said, UK, the British land forces need to be ready to fight in 3 years. And there's been this 2027 number bandied around about when China might do something with Taiwan. And if you've got a war rolling, which is still, then the question would be at what intensity is it rolling? Does it become like the zone of, or the line of conflict? It's artillery, it peaks and troughs, but it's manageable and fairly low scale, or is it still at the huge rate that we're seeing? in certain parts of the front now. So my take is, I'd say, to answer the question, I don't really know about the long-term indicators, but more experts than me would say that Russia's going to be in a pinch come next year and start to feel it. And then, of course, it's to do to a large degree about what China and what would it be going on in the rest of the world at that stage.
Dr. Patrick Bury, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Cheers, James. Pleasure again.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.